Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Restrictions on movement due to the greatest health crisis in the world has disrupted billions of lives for the past 4 months. We all wonder when this will end. But in Jammu and Kashmir, a valley of 8 million people and the most militarized zone in the world, there has been a draconian lockdown in place since the past 11 months. This lockdown was not imposed because of a health crisis, but in fact was imposed in anticipation of local reactions to a move that stripped Indian-occupied Kashmir of its special status on the 5th of August. Since then, lives in Kashmir have been put under tremendously abnormal circumstances. On today's show, we talk about the human cost of what is regarded as the longest lockdown in modern times. Joining us for the conversation today is Mr. Zaffar, Qureshi, the chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global. He joins us from London. Also joining us today is Mr. Patrick Sullivan, chairman and CEO of Parliament Street, which is a UK think tank. He also joins us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, I think a good point to start off this conversation is by discussing how the nature of the lockdown in Kashmir varies so significantly from what we've been seeing happening all across the world in the past 4 months. We saw on social media a lot of people drawing comparisons to how this must be the lives of those without internet connections, without movement. But how different is this contrast?
Meshal, thank you very much for this opportunity. Indeed, the reality on the ground is very different. Kashmir is what we would classify as under a triple lockdown. The initial lockdown obviously started back in 1989 when the over 800,000 armed forces came in. But especially last 10 months, since the 5th of August, when the Indian government abrogated the Article 370 and then recently introduced the domicile, Kashmir has been in lockdown since the 5th of August, so more than the 4 months. And this wasn't because of any COVID. It was purely to ensure that the people, the rights and the fundamentals of the people of Kashmir have been snatched away from them. Their internet, our communications have been blocked, our freedom to move, our freedom to preach our religion has been snatched away, and they've been taken off from us. In the last 10 months, Kashmir has been under a complete curfew with no economic trading at all. People have been imprisoned, tortured, and killed. And recently, after the COVID, that was another lockdown where the restrictions were further imposed, which hindered the humanitarian activities within the Kashmir. The humanitarian aid agency that used to work within Kashmir, providing food to the millions who were left without any economical activity, without any income for the last 10 months, were further hindered. And India made sure that none of these humanitarian agencies, including the local agency, I'm not just talking about the international agencies which have never been allowed by India to work in Kashmir, the local agencies were restricted to do any kind of an aid or provide any aid into do. Now, can you imagine, outside the world, we've been under the lockdown for the last 4 months, and already we have seen the signs of the economies of many countries crippling down. People are unable to meet their basic needs, even in the developed countries. I know personally in the United Kingdom, I work with many of the volunteer organizations here, thousands and thousands of families are suffering. Now, can you imagine people living in a occupied zone, which has been in the lockdown for the last 10 months?
Mr. Qureshi, you put out a couple of points here, and I'm going to get to those, but to that point of imagining how different the scenario in Kashmir is, while the world only gets to experience only a fraction of that kind of a lockdown. I want to take this question to Mr. Patrick Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, after the 5th of August, when India first revoked Kashmir's special status, there was a lot of outcry in the global community. But as the months passed and as the docket for international issues filled up, more and more we saw that empathy decreasing. But now when the global community experiences, as I'm saying, only a fraction of that lockdown and seeing the economic hurdles, seeing the humanitarian cost of it, do you think that this is a point for renewed empathy to build up for this cause?
Well, I certainly think it's a cause for renewed empathy. I mean, the headline on the Mail on Sunday, which is one of Britain's big national newspapers over this weekend, was the day Britain smiled again. And what Britain has gone through has not been pleasant, but it has been nothing near what the people of Kashmir have had to suffer and endure. The internet was an essential part of the British people having a sense of normality in their lives. They were able to socialise on Zoom. They were able to do shopping on Amazon. The lockdown was an extreme inconvenience, but it did not fundamentally change their way of life. It was not akin to being prisoner in your own home as it is in Kashmir. It is completely different. And the other thing is, I think, given that most Western countries had a collective meltdown over being in a sort of light lockdown, a sort of lockdown where you're allowed to go out for a jog, sort of thing. There's a collective meltdown after about 4 months. And the July the 4th that's just passed was called Independence Day. Now, if that is how the West reacts to just a sort of scintilla of what the people of Kashmir are going through, I think, yes, it will increase empathy. Absolutely. I think, to your other point about international organizations, I mean, the UN was set up in order to deal with things exactly, violations of international law is the same, in the way that India are doing to the people of Kashmir every day. And if no meaningful action is taken by the United Nations, it will render itself as obsolete in the eyes of the world and make the whole concept of international law look like a joke. And there's precedent for something like this happening before. When the United Nations predecessor, the League of Nations, didn't restrain Mussolini's Italy from its aggression towards the then Empire of Ethiopia, it became considered impotent. And it was after that, it was because of that.
And Mr. Patrick Sullivan, to your point there about the United Nations being rendered as futile, as useless, given how it hasn't taken the necessary actions, the Kashmir dispute remains to be the oldest unresolved disagreement on the United Nations docket. Now, while we say that the United Nations is, I would argue, to the point of being complicit in allowing what is happening, what about the international community? What about the European Union? What about the powerful states in the world? What are they doing in order to keep this issue alive?
Not enough. That's the answer. And in fact, in certain respects, things have got worse instead of got better. In England, the previous leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, he'd stood shoulder to shoulder with the people of Pakistan in relation to Kashmir. However, there was after the general election, he stepped down. The new leader was elected, and he seems to have changed Labour Party position on Kashmir, and I think that's a tremendous setback. I can quote you what he said to an April 30th meeting of the Labour Friends of India group. Any constitutional issues in India are a matter for the Indian Parliament, and Kashmir is a bilateral issue for India and Pakistan to resolve peacefully. Labour is an internationalist party and stands for the defence of human rights everywhere. Now, those sound like weasel words to me.
Right. Definitely. Mr. Patrick Sullivan, it does seem like it's business as usual with the international community here. There is not enough pushback that at least the Kashmiris were hoping that the world would give to this. Thank you so much, Mr. Patrick Sullivan, for joining us from London. We're now joined by Mr. Gowhar Geelani, who's a journalist and commentator and the author of the book Kashmir, Rage and Reason, which was published in 2019. He joins us from Srinagar. Thank you so much, Mr. Geelani, for joining us. Now, given how we're discussing how different what is happening in Kashmir is from the rest of the world during this lockdown, it's best to talk about what the on-ground situation is. The point about communication for everyone across the world being a lifeline during this difficult time has been brought up. In Kashmir, I believe that even that is not a facility available to the people. How are individuals coping?
Thank you for having me in your show. As far as the communication channels are concerned, they still continue to be, we don't have 4G high-speed internet, not restored still since last August. I talked to businessmen. There's a leading body, Kashmir Chamber of Commerce. And in the first initial 4 months post-August 5, they had estimated a loss of 18,000 crores rupee for the businesses and tourism industry. And if you have that estimation and approximation into account, so the tourism industry and other businesses have lost over like 55,000 crore rupee since then. So that is one aspect. And they, according to their estimate, more than 1 lakh people have lost jobs who were directly or indirectly involved with IT sector or tourism sector. So now there is, continued, this is a second lockdown because of the COVID pandemic since March now. And now, bizarrely, the government has taken a decision to allow a pilgrimage which is a holy pilgrimage for Hindus, and they are allowing that yatra. But until today, the common people, there is still a ban on Friday congregation. There's ban on all religious, social, and other gatherings, civil society gatherings. But at the same time, they allowed a yatra, which is seen as a very nationalistic pilgrimage. And then they also allowed parks to open today, just to show that they are doing a balancing act. So the COVID situation is also very tricky. But overall, I think, I was listening to your conversation with the other guest about this international community and other human rights bodies and the European community. I think it's all futile in the eyes of Kashmiris. For the last 70 years, it's all this support, what the EU thinks or what the US thinks or what the UN does. UN 4 special rapporteurs have written a letter to Indian government. But, all the Indian liberals, even liberals like Barkha Dutt, liberals like, Shekhar Gupta, who are in journalism and media fraternity, they term those reports as airy-fairy and motivated and fabricated. So, just relying on these international, bodies is just a futile exercise in the eyes of common Kashmiris who continue to be at to bear the brunt of all the violence that is being perpetrated again on them.
And Mr. Geelani, to that point of violence that is being inflicted upon the Kashmiris, I want us to take a look at a picture together. This is a picture of Bashir Ahmed Khan, a 65-year-old resident of Srinagar. This picture, of course, went viral. Everyone on social media was talking about it for a very specific reason, because it's not just a very striking image. It also exemplifies the entirety of the situation, the human cost, the trauma that has been inflicted upon Kashmiris. What was your reaction when you saw this picture, Mr. Geelani?
It was very horrible. I mean, I was reminded of a similar picture that came from Syria, where a very young, similar toddler was near the banks of, a river. So, we have had, several pictures like these in the last 30 years. There was another gruesome picture of one Farooq Dar, who was a civilian who was tied to the bonnet of an army jeep. And there were other pictures of, other children of conflict. But regarding this, it was not only heart-wrenching, but it was also a moment to reflect that how a tragedy, human tragedy, as colossal as a human tragedy as this one, and still this was choreographed for PR and propaganda purpose. So that was one thing which shook our conscience, and it was enough to stir our conscience. But I just want to bring your focus also to a report which has been released by Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, JKCCS, which is a prominent human rights body which documents human rights abuse in Kashmir. So that says, in the first 6 months, we have had 229 killings in Kashmir, of which more than 32 have been civilians, which include children and women, and there are extrajudicial killings which they have documented. But it is the people of Kashmir who are bearing the brunt, and the domicile thing, which has actually made people so anxious about their land demography, and they are fearing that a demographic change will be engineered on the lines which happened in Jammu in 1947, when a Muslim majority character of Jammu province was overnight changed into Muslim minority region. So such fears, more than 30,000 certificates have been given to non-Kashmiris, which include a senior bureaucrat from the Indian state of Bihar. And there are 6,600 Gorkha soldiers and ex-army officers who have gotten this new domicile, and they have become Kashmiris. So tomorrow, down the line in 1 year, if there is some referendum, I think that's also a matter of concern for many in Kashmir.
Mr. Gowhar, Geelani, I want to come back what is happening on the ground, but I also want to discuss a tweet that was released by the BDS Movement. Now, when we look at this tweet, it talks about India borrowing Israel's model of apartheid and colonialism as reflected in its new racist citizenship law and removal of Kashmir's special status. Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, now the reason why I bring up this tweet is because this parallel has been drawn countless times, that India is borrowing tactics from Israel about how to become a settler colony and the tactics to be used over there. Can BDS, a movement like BDS that is there to boycott and sanction India, also work in the cause of Kashmir?
It's absolutely correct. India is following currently the Israeli tactics or naxuses in order to colonize and create a settler colony in Kashmir. And it's just not now. As you heard the previous guest speaking, it started way back in 1947 when over 200,000 Muslims were massacred and then replaced by the Hindu fascists. But at the same time, what India is also doing is following the fascist ideology of the Nazism, where it wants to propagate its Hindutva Akhand force. Now, coming back to the BDS question that you have on the international level, we've seen that it's actually proved somewhat effective, a peaceful means on the international level where it dents the economy of the oppressor. So I do hope that the international community will buy into this and start looking at the BDS movement. But the reality, as you heard, is the international community must realize that the government, the fascist regime that they are dealing with, does not believe in peaceful negotiation or talks. The international community, including the UN, must now wake up and understand that we do not want the history to repeat it as in back during the time of a Hitler. This is a dire issue that not just impacts the people of Kashmir, but across Asia, and will have a global impact. With the recent development in China, it has definitely become a nuclear flashpoint with more probability of having a nuclear war. And
Mr. Qureshi, sorry to interject here, but as we've been discussing utility of these international organizations, the BDS movement largely organized by civil society. Do you think this is a route that is being taken by the international diaspora, by communities abroad? Do you think that this is something they're heading towards?
This is being currently discussed, and people are getting involved in the BDS. A lot more needs to be done. This BDS movement has to be taken at the political, at the government levels for each of the people-loving countries. Starting from Pakistan, we've seen Pakistan as being it's the second biggest market for the Bollywood movies. So yes, while it may work and it will have an impact on the Indian economy, but unless the governments are serious about it and actually start owning it, it may not yield many effects.
Right. Mr. Gowhar, Geelani, you mentioned the domicile laws, and we earlier were also talking about unemployment rates on the rise. What is the frustration, the mood and atmosphere like amongst the youth of Jammu and Kashmir?
As far as the youth are concerned, I think they don't only feel dispossessed, disadvantaged, marginalized, but also disempowered on multiple counts. I will give you an example. Recently the J&K administration came up with a new media policy, which is J&K Media Policy 2020. According to that policy, any criticism of the government or administration or any, that report would be deemed as fake, unethical, anti-national, seditious, and then a government organ, which is the Directorate of Public Relations and Information Department, will be empowered to initiate a legal action against journalists. And since August, we have had more than 32 journalists who have been summoned to various police stations, cyber police station, and there are, including me, we have these cases under draconian UAPA, Unlawful Activities and Prevention Act, and IPC, Indian Penal Code, and other RPC, Ranbir Penal Code. So even this 26-year-old Masrat Zehra, a photojournalist, was booked under the same law. So, this is a routine that every day we hear journalists being summoned to various police stations for normal reporting. So they want to criminalize, opinions. They want to, kill journalism. And it has been already described by RSF as Orwellian and Kafkaesque. Talking about these things, this is what the journalists are feeling. So you can only imagine what the civil society is feeling. Every section of the society is feeling the heat, and primarily the concern is about identity, land, demography. So these are the concerns, and they don't care what happens on the borders, what happens with China and Ladakh, because these geopolitical situations take a lot of time to instigate any change on the ground. But the facts on the ground in Kashmir are changing so fast that I think within a year's time, Kashmiris can be minority in their own land.
Right, Mr. Geelani, we're going to continue that conversation on identity. I just want to put one last question to Mr. Zaffar Qureshi here. Mr. Qureshi, you mentioned the power of Bollywood. Mr. Geelani has also talked about how journalists who are trying to report on the ground are being persecuted. I want to talk about I want to break apart the PR campaign that has been launched by the Indian government that includes Bollywood, that includes other factions of society, and the narrative that they're propagating. How can the international community see through it?
I think one of the key things that the international community must do is actually force India to end the communication boycott. We need to look at the reality that's happening on the ground. The narrative that India is creating, that it is a secular, democratic, progressive country, is a false narrative. And the international community, we've had reports from the United Nations. We've seen reports coming from the ground itself. We need to make sure that we are presenting the real face of India on the international level, especially news channels like yourselves. And, we just heard Gowhar speaking about how the freedom of speech, the freedom of journalism, they've been targeted to make sure the reality India is not coming. The international community, including NGOs, the media fraternity, needs to come together and make sure the correct narrative, the reality of India, both in Kashmir and what's happening in India with the Dalits, with the Sikhs, with the other communities, is presented to the world.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Qureshi, for joining us from London. We're going to go for a short break. When we come back, we discuss how Kashmiris are observing the death anniversary of Burhan Wani. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. 4 years ago, on the 8th of July, rebel leader Burhan Wani was shot dead by Indian armed forces in a remote Kashmir village. Soon after Wani's death, a wave of deadly protests gripped the valley. Wani's death is seen to be an important turning point in Kashmir's history. Let's discuss this further. Joining us for this conversation is Mr. Gowhar Geelani, who's a journalist and a commentator and the author of the Kashmir Rage and Reason. He joins us from Srinagar. Also joining us is Ms. Sobia Shawl, who's a humanitarian and a solicitor practicing in the UK. She was also born in Indian-occupied Kashmir. She joins us from London. Ms. Shawl, I'd like to begin with you. Now, Burhan Wani is seen to be an icon for the youth in Kashmir. Today, too, his death anniversary is being observed across the valley. What does he truly represent?
Burhan Wani basically represents resistance, who represents hope of the youth. His sacrifice and struggle has transformed the meaning of resilience and strengthened the determination of the people to attain their freedom, especially youth. The youth idolize him and is a symbol of hope for the people of Kashmir.
Right. And when we're talking about this tale being observed right now, what impact do you think his killing had on the youth, had on the community at large?
Generally, impact of killing, what can the impact of killing be described as? Is basically the youth has been in lockdown, and the pandemic has been used against this lockdown, and currently the youth is struggling. The education system has completely collapsed in Kashmir, and the people are suffering for health, the people are suffering from education deprivation, and people are suffering mentally and physically, as seen by the recent incident which went viral of Bashir Ahmed Khan and his grandchild that was seen all over social media, basically.
Right. Mr. Gowhar Geelani, your book, of course, works out extensively the history, the identity of the Kashmiris. When I talk about the death and the killing of Burhan Wani being a turning point in Kashmir's history, do you see it as monumental as I say it out to be?
I mean, you have to understand that this topic is very controversial. In the eyes of New Delhi, for example, he was someone who picked up a gun, and they described him as a terrorist who took up arms against the state, and who, according to their view, deserved what he got. And from the ground, many see him as someone who lifted the veil and started a new age of rebellion in Kashmir. As a militant leader, and actually took to social media, used Facebook and other apps to lure youth into militancy. So it's a very controversial subject about his methods that he used. As a journalist, I have to give both versions about his story. But I have been to his house, and I have spoken to his father and other family members, and I also mentioned that in detail. What happened in his life was when his older brother was actually, he was allegedly beaten in front of his eyes, which shook him, and he was only 16-year-old at the time when he then decided to, do what he did. And then eventually his brother was also killed. He had a master's degree. And then since 2010, after 2010, there was a new age of militancy in Kashmir, which actually lifted the veil, and they came in open. They did not wear any masks. And then from, in 2016, he got killed. So since then, the Pakistani Prime Minister, the then Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif spoke about him at the UN and described him as a hero, and to which New Delhi took serious objections. So it continues to be a very controversial subject today. Also, there are people who are hailing him on social media, and there are, there have been restrictions in South Kashmir and other parts of Kashmir. In northern parts of Kashmir, internet is completely banned to prevent any gathering, pay any kind of tributes to him. But social media is abuzz. There are arguments in favor of him from Kashmir, and there are arguments against him from the Indian perspective.
Right,
so it remains to be very controversial.
Right, Mr. Geelani, if we take out the state narratives from this, put those aside, what changes do you feel like happened after the 8th of July in 2016? Was there a tangible or noticeable difference before that day and after that day on the ground?
I think we will have to go back to early 2000 when the Srinagar-Muzaffarabad road was reopened. It was 2005 April when after 58 yawning gap of 58 years, the Srinagar-Muzaffarabad road was opened, a bus service was started, and that actually created an atmosphere that something is possible on the lines of what happened in the when the Berlin Wall fell. So that gave people hope that actually political dialogue is possible. But what happened afterwards, immediately when Musharraf was at the helm of affairs in Pakistan, and he also floated what is often referred to as 4-point formula, but then something else happened in Bombay. The Mumbai attack and the government, there was a government change, UPA 2 came into being. So then all the dialogue and, all the processes, composite dialogue process remained stalled. And then 2008 agitation happened in Kashmir. Amarnath land row happened. Many boys got killed. 2010 happened. Again, more than 100 boys got killed. Tufail Mottu and Wamik Farooq, these are the symbolic names from that protest. And then people, there was lack of trust in the institution of dialogue. The institution of dialogue was discredited simultaneously. And that, culminated in 2016 when there was this realization that actually nothing comes out of these dialogues because there is no sincerity. And then Burhan had actually changed that. He had it was a new kind of a paradigm shift. But since last 4 years, a lot has changed since. Now the ground facts, as I said earlier, stand completely altered in Kashmir. It is people are seeing this as not only a cultural assault, it is also an assault on the identity. It's about demographics, it's about land, it's about identity. And there is a genuine fear and anxiety among people that they will be turned into minority in their own land. Here on the ground, facts are changing so fast that it is unimaginable that how fast things are changing.
So, Mr. Shawl, earlier we talked about the new domicile laws, how they're changing. And as Mr. Gowhar Geelani reiterates that things are changing so fast on the ground, do you fear as a Kashmiri living outside of Kashmir that one day it will be too difficult for you to return back home? Or is that the current reality as it stands right now as well?
That's a reality I was born in, and that's a reality I feel like will stay until I am in the UK. I've moved when I was quite young. I was only 4 months old when my parents were forced to move and migrate to Pakistan. And then I moved to United Kingdom when I was only 12 years old. I see my family every year. They travel to Pakistan and to see it. But I've seen what the suffering of Kashmiri people is when they are completely torn away and completely taken away by their own land, when deaths happen in the family and you're at the border crying because you will never be allowed to enter. Due to political reasons and the demographic, I feel like that's the ground reality, and I have to live with the fact that maybe the place I was born in Baramulla, I would never be able to return there in my lifetime.
Right. Now, this, of course, is happening. The Indian government claims it is itself as a democracy. What kind of precedent do you think this is setting for other countries for transgressions in human rights violations when we look at the state of Kashmir and it happening under the rule of a democracy?
Well, currently every country that states and is doing basic violation of human rights, basic violation of freedom of speech, basic violation of people for rights to education, basic violation of health centers being closed or severe disruption to even reach the health centers. That just shows that democracy is just a face that is used to breach all international laws and all United Nations laws. And it's just a face to hide behind the fact, to tell the international media that this is a democratic country. However, people being treated as a minority in their own country, in their own homeland, I can only just say that this democracy is just a face, and it's just a face used to tell the people and tell the national that it's a democratic country. However, it will never be and it can't be with such basic human rights violations.
Right. Mr. Gowhar, that point of identity, one thing that Ms. Shawl has also stated, you also stated, is the fear of that the majority in Kashmir right now will one day become a minority. How palpable is that fear amongst the people at this point?
Not one day. I mean, I think it's going to happen very, very soon because according to this new domicile order, more than 20 lakh non-Kashmiris are eligible to become, Kashmiri domiciles. New permanent residents of Jammu and Kashmir. So it's not something that is spoken about with a figment of imagination. It is something very real, and that's happening very, very fast. As I said, 6,600 Gorkha soldiers got domicile certificates just a few days ago. Before that, already 25 to 30,000 domicile certificates were issued in Jammu region to West Pakistan refugees and also other communities who were non-Kashmiris. And a very senior bureaucrat from the Indian state of Bihar, Naveen Chaudhary, got a domicile, as a Kashmiri domicile. So this fear is very, very palpable. And everybody is speaking, about it, but nobody knows what to do about it because all the structures of resistance in the civil society, in other political formations, from the unionist camp who are also pro-India, they are giving statements after 9 months since August. Now they have started to make some statements and to make some noise, and the Hurriyat is totally shattered. It as if it was a rumor which just blew away. There is no Hurriyat on the ground. So people don't know. There's a leadership crisis. So that's why people don't know what to do about it because there's not a lot that they can can do actually, because they are feeling dispossessed. And I don't agree with this kind of, what the international community might and might not do. They know everything that's happening in Kashmir since last 30 years. And Palestinians have got so much of international support, but still the issue has not been resolved. So just to rely on what the European Union might say in a statement, that's not going to alter facts here. But what the actions of the Bharatiya Janata Party ruling dispensation has done, they have altered the facts on the ground. That is the unpalatable and irrefutable reality that Kashmiris are face to face with.
Mr. Geelani, just one question, and this might be a personal question to you, but this fear of your identity being under threat, what does that do to a person? What types of emotions come into, rise out of an individual? How do you feel as a Kashmiri at this point?
See, I mean, it's about when I grew up in my family in Srinagar's downtown. So we owned a piece of land. So we knew it belonged to me. It belonged to my father. It belonged to my uncles. Similarly, I live in a house, but I am not sure that, if my second generation is going to have that, because we do not have exclusive rights on our land. Earlier, because of the law, Article 35A, and because of other arrangements that Srinagar, the relationship between Srinagar and Delhi, it was the J&K Legislative Assembly was empowered to define who the permanent residents of Jammu and Kashmir were, and then granted upon them several rights and privileges, which included scholarships, government jobs, and right to immovable property and land. All of that is gone. So this is not about me. This is about our next generation. And every single Kashmiri is feeling so much dispossessed that they have lost that identity of being called a Kashmiri. And then if you add another identity, that is religious identity. So it's not only the ethnic identity, it's also the religious identity which is under attack. So there's a lot of assaults happening. And I think, unless something big geopolitical event takes place, or, I have no hopes on the international community. We have been saying this for the last 30 years, and people have been, writing letters and all that. That doesn't change anything on the ground, because countries like Germany, France, and other, they have economic relations with India. India is a huge market for them. They send their Rafales and Volkswagen to India, so they don't care what's happening on the ground. Not that they don't know, they know everything. Every country knows what is happening on the ground, but they also have to do business. So, that's why there's a lot of hopelessness in Kashmir right now.
Right, and I think that's the note we're going to end the show on. There is a lot of hope in Kashmir, and this is a question not just about the Kashmiris right now, but about their generations, their future generations. Thank you so much, Mr. Gowhar Geelani, for joining us from Srinagar, and Ms. Sobia Shawl for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.